Hey everyone, it's me, Drew Afwalo, host of the Comment Section Show. Come join me and one of my iconic special guests every week on the show as we dive into the dreaded comment sections of our tagged videos and take down the most terrible men on the internet, period. Somehow, they won't go away no matter what I do, no matter how incredibly awful and mean I am to them, but I don't mind doing this work. In fact, if I'm being honest, I think it's God's work. So make sure y'all follow me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes every Wednesday.
Hello, and welcome to Dyslexia Devoted, the podcast dedicated to building awareness, understanding, and strategies to help those with dyslexia. I'm your host, Lisa Parnello, dyslexia therapist and founder of Parnello Education Services. Join me as we dive into today's episode of Dyslexia Devoted. Hello, and welcome, everyone. Whether this is your first episode or you've attended the 108 that came before this one, I'm so glad that you're here today. This summer, I have done a ton of professional development, as in I'm the one presenting it, but I've also attended some professional development as well. So I wanted this episode to be about one of my favorite ones that I attended so that I can share my latest knowledge with you guys. Today's episode number 109 of Dyslexia Devoted is all about developmental language disorder. Now, this is a term that I know pretty well because I read so many reports about kids with learning differences. It's what I do all day. But it is something that has had a term that has changed over the years depending on who's diagnosing it, and it doesn't have a universal understanding until recently, using one common language to describe it. And it's about students who have trouble acquiring language. When we think about dyslexia, kids with dyslexia also have trouble with language. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because one doesn't necessarily omit the other. A child might have a developmental language disorder, or they might have dyslexia, or they could have both. And I definitely have worked with multiple kids who have both of these conditions, and a few that just had developmental language disorder. So let's talk about dyslexia specifically. Typically, we notice this with poor word recognition, poor decoding skills, and they tend to have pretty good listening comprehension. As soon as you hand them a book to read by themselves, then they tend to struggle a lot more because it's really the decoding that is hindering their ability to understand the text more than the words itself. Now, when you combine dyslexia with developmental language disorder, you also add in some poor listening comprehension and poor ability to be able to learn new vocabulary. This is really a struggle for kids because so much of our world relies on either reading or communicating orally. So when you're not very good at either one of those, then that creates all new barriers and a lot of frustration, and can also lead to some behavior challenges. I know I have one student that, even I am guilty of this, where I get so annoyed with him because he will not answer me when I talk to him. He will respond, but he won't answer me. And so he will do what I'm asking him to do, but will look like he's ignoring me. And it's really because of his poor language skills and his poor ability to express back to me what he needs to do or to clarify that he understands. And he doesn't use very many words. And one of the things that it's really hard for kids with developmental language disorder is developing their vocabulary. A lot of times kids with dyslexia have much higher vocabulary than they do when they have to read it in a book when you're talking to them orally. But a child with developmental language struggles doesn't have that. So then they have this double deficit where it makes it extra challenging for them because even orally, things are still not easy for them. Even when you take away the books and the paper and the written stuff, even just normal conversation can be more challenging for them. The one boy I'm thinking of, there was one day that I just didn't even know how to answer him because he says, "That's not a word," when it very clearly was a word, but it's not a word he has. His vocabulary is so low that it's not like it's a word he thinks he just doesn't know the meaning of. He just thinks it's just not a word at all. And he gets very annoyed with me when I try to explain to him what a word means, when he just is insistent there are just too many words in this world, that there is no reason we need this many words. And I actually even had an older girl today give me that same response of, why do we have that many words? Like, why can't this word just mean this one thing? Why does it have to mean so many different things? And another instance in the same session going, wait, why do we have yet another word that means this thing? Like, can't we just call them all large instead of huge, gigantic, enormous? Why do we need so many words for this? And this is where you end up with some challenges when kids don't realize that there's a scale when it comes to words. That we don't just say everything's big. They can be big, large, gigantic, enormous, expansive, and it goes on a continuum of which one means the biggest of them all. And they don't always see that. They just see that there's too many words that all mean big. And it makes me think of a book by Patricia Polacco. And in the book, it is an A for Miss Keller. And in the book, she says love. And she makes her say, you don't feel the same way about your pancakes as you do your mom. Love is one thing, and you can't necessarily say you love everything because it's not really all the same. What you feel for your pancakes is not the same feeling you have for a family member. So when you use love all the time, it doesn't really represent the same thing, and that words matter and they have power. And this is where we have to help our kids with developmental language struggles because they don't naturally pick up language. It's a lot more challenging for them to learn what some of these words mean. And we can use a lot of the same strategies that we do for dyslexia. So teaching things like morphology. If it's really hard for them to learn the meaning of new words, if we can teach them morphology where they just have to learn a few base meanings, and then they can build vocabulary off of those little bases they already know, then it makes it a lot easier to learn new words. Because the way our brain works is we build connections within our mind of things we already know, and we add to the information in our heads. And so if we can give them a solid foundation of information that's already in their head, that can really help. So now that you have a better understanding of what a developmental language disorder is, let's talk about what it looks like. Because a lot of times, giving something a label only means so much if you don't know how to recognize it. Just like calling something dyslexia, but then not knowing how to recognize it. Like the teacher who told me she's never had a kid with dyslexia in her class. I'm sorry. I love you dearly. But there's no way that is true. Everybody has had a kid with dyslexia in their class if they're a teacher. They just didn't know how to recognize it. So let's talk about how do we recognize developmental language disorder. It is when a child has a difficulty learning words, learning vocabulary, and their grammar. So I think about the kid who still talks in baby talk when he's in the 5th grade because he doesn't know how to use more sophisticated grammar and more complex sentences. It is often a language delay, and it's not really that they're going to catch up. It is they may always be a little bit behind their peers. And often you will see it as them being really late talkers when they're infants. In the classroom, they might be shy, they might be hesitant to participate, they might drop sentences and not really finish their stories, they might talk in stories that don't quite make sense and be really unclear to the person listening to them. I definitely have a little girl who's like that. When she tells me a story, I have no concept of when it happened or who was there or quite exactly why she's telling me the story. And a lot of times they will look to their peers for answers. There's one kiddo I used to work with that has a twin, and he didn't really talk because his twin did all of his talking for him. When you take a very outgoing kid and a very shy kid, a lot of times one sibling will help cope for the other one. And they end up with this bond, especially you add in the fact that they were twins. That really didn't help anything either because they had that twin bond going on top of it. When a child has developmental language disorder, they might get mislabeled as being uncooperative, mischievous, emotional, or unintelligent. Because think about all the things that we do with our language. We follow directions. We give directions. We solve our problems with people by talking them out. We might need to be mischievous. If we don't know how to cope, we find ways to get around what we're supposed to do. And think about how frustrating it is when you can't communicate. And then you become really emotional because people don't understand what you're trying to tell them. And they could just get all frustrated and then they groan at you. Yes, I have a girl that will actually groan at me when she gets annoyed. There are no words that come out of her mouth. It's just noise. And this child is not small. She's definitely maybe almost as tall as I am. And these can really co-occur with other learning differences. So sometimes this might happen with dyslexia on top of it. Or it might happen separately. Maybe they can read and sound out words fine, but they really have trouble with developing the language and the comprehension. We also have to think about how much language happens in all of our other subject areas. It's not just reading. It happens in math. Think about word problems and reading the directions. And math has its own vocabulary. There's a whole new set of words you have to learn what they mean in math class. Approximately 1 in 10 children has developmental language disorder. And a lot of times you will notice it in the varying terms that has been used over the years, such as an SLD in language, a developmental delay, a language impairment, or a speech and language impairment. And so all of those terms can all be used interchangeably and get all these different diagnoses for the same condition. And this is where they're trying to create a more universal understanding of it and now calling it a developmental language disorder. And this disorder has now been included in IDEA, which is letting the children get services for having this language difference. So if you would like to learn more about developmental language disorder, you can check out dldandme.org. I will put a link where you are listening to this right now. I have absolutely loved listening to Dr. Tiffany Hogan explain all about it. This was my quick rundown of my notes from listening to her, and much credit and shout out to her for trying to bring about some change and some understanding. And I loved how she used the way that dyslexia has grown and gotten a better understanding in our community and in our school systems, so that she is hoping that developmental language disorder can do very much the same path of slowly growing more and more awareness so that more kids with language struggles can get the help that they need. And she also provided some resources in her talk about developmental language disorder, so I will give you the links to those toolboxes too. So big shout out to Dr. Tiffany Hogan for all of the hard work that she is doing to help kids. All right, that is it for today. To recap, let's go over the different things we talked about. Dyslexia is a learning difference having to do with decoding, and typically they have stronger verbal comprehension skills, compared to developmental language disorder that has poor language comprehension skills and has a more difficult time learning vocabulary with or without looking at it on paper, just being able to develop a higher level of vocabulary and grammar. And we also talked about how dyslexia and developmental language disorder can co-occur and happen in the same child, which makes things really difficult because a lot of times we compensate with something by something else we're stronger at. So if a child isn't very good at reading, they can compensate by using their verbal skills. But when they have poor verbal skills, then that can lead to feelings of frustration. And in turn, those students might start acting out. If you would like to learn more about this, I am going to put all the links for the resources that I got from Dr. Tiffany Hogan. So I hope you are able to take a little bit of extra knowledge from this, because we always like to keep expanding our knowledge so that we can help more and more kids of all sorts of different learning differences to be successful in life. That's it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you want to learn even more about dyslexia, check out parnelloeducation.com/courses. See you next time.